tell you a little bit about my background. My bio's in the program. So I have now spent, I just came from my 25th college reunion. So I have now officially spent 25 years working in the social sector. I actually started out as a social entrepreneur back in the early 1990s. And so one of the speakers up here earlier who gave a shout out to Public Allies, who ran Public Allies Los Angeles, I remember being down the hall from Vanessa Kirsch when she was starting Public Allies in Washington, D.C., and writing about AmeriCorps when it was first being launched in 1993, building on the Points of Light Foundation work under the Bush administration. So I really grew up in the social entrepreneurship movement and the youth service movement, and I've seen a lot of these trends from a very personal, firsthand perspective. So I started as a social entrepreneur, and then like many entrepreneurs in my generation, I went back to get my MBA, because that's what everybody said you had to do if you were going to be a good nonprofit leader, is go learn management practices. So I did that. And then I worked in consulting for about a decade. I worked briefly at McKinsey. I spent almost 5 years at the Monitor Institute, which is now part of Deloitte Consulting. And then about 2.5 years ago, went out on my own, and I'm really trying to focus a lot of my work in California. But the thing I want you to know is that I have actually been an executive director. I'm chairing the board of a Draper Richards Kaplan funded organization. So I've worn a lot of the hats that you all are wearing. I write about and try and talk about what I'm learning in my work, but very much from a practitioner's perspective. And I still do some consulting with clients in the Bay Area. But perhaps the most important thing you need to know about me that's not up here and not really on my resume is that I'm actually from Fresno, California. So anybody from Fresno in the house? Woohoo! Okay, anybody from Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley? All right, from where? Bakersfield, yes. All right. Stockton. All right, we've got a few in the house. Okay, so you guys from LA, I know LA and San Francisco like to look down on poor Fresno and Bakersfield. And I get it. I mean, there's a lot of problems in the Central Valley, but I would say the reason I'm standing up here today is because I grew up in a community that has some of the highest concentrations of poverty in the United States. 1 in 3 kids living in poverty. 2010 congressional report called it the Appalachia of the West. And what's been amazing in the last couple years, since deciding to focus less nationally and more locally in my practice, I've had the amazing opportunity to go back into Fresno and work on behalf of the James Irvine Foundation, working with leaders like all of you trying to solve some of these problems. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that work in just a few minutes, but I wanted to kind of bring it home with a very local California perspective. So my journey around this question of scale and impact really started, well, it started really when I was a social entrepreneur and then went back to business school. But then coming out of business school, my co-author, Leslie Crutchfield, and I had been working in and around this field, and we'd read all these amazing books like Good to Great by Jim Collins, right? And we'd read all these sort of business case studies about what makes great businesses great. And we're like, why hasn't anybody done this research on nonprofits, right? We have our own sector, and even though a lot of folks say you can take best practice from business, and you can take a lot of best practices from business and apply them to nonprofits, there are things that are actually quite different about our sector. So we decided to go out and research some of the most impactful, most highly scaled nonprofits of our time. And we started this work back in 2005. We both had very young children, and we thought, I know this will be our mom in tennis shoes project. We'll do this while we've got our little babies and we can flex it around our schedule. Well, guess what? It took us 4 years from start to finish to write the book. I think we might have been able to do it faster if we weren't juggling it with young children. We picked 12 of the highest impact nonprofits that had gotten to levels of national or international scale in the last 25 or 30 years. So this is the equivalent of like the Fortune, you know, not even the Fortune 500, but the Fortune 10 or 15, sort of the most highly scaled, highest impact organizations of our time. And we wanted to understand what made them tick. So we went out and spent 2 years actually doing really in-depth case study research. And you can see up here, you can see the kind of proverbial hockey stick. I live in Silicon Valley now. My husband works in high tech. This is what venture capitalists love, right? They love to see this like kind of growth rate. Well, in our case, unlike eBay and Google and Facebook and Instagram, we're not talking about billions of dollars. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars. So some of the largest nonprofits of our time got to an average size of around 40, 50 million. But it wasn't really just about their growth. What we learned when we actually went out and studied these organizations, that scaling your nonprofit is not exactly the same as scaling your impact. So we were actually kind of surprised by what we found. We thought we were going to go in and find that it really had to do about, you know, site replication and expansion, or being able to raise more money more effectively. And yes, these nonprofits did all of this, But that wasn't what they had in common. When we really looked closely at the data, we found something quite counterintuitive. That is, many of these organizations were able to scale their impact exponentially and sometimes have 10x the impact without necessarily having to grow their sites or expand to more and more cities or even reach more and more people. They did this by working across sectors and by building a network nonprofit. So they engaged with government, they did advocacy, they leveraged market forces and helped markets work more efficiently, worked with companies and corporations to engage the resources of the private sector. They built networks with other nonprofits, and they inspired and engaged evangelists around their cause. So we talk about in the book, what we really write about is how they scaled their impact by using these leverage points and changing systems, right? Not just continuing to grow their organization in perpetuity. So that was my first insight, that scaling social impact isn't just about building an amazing and perfect organization. Doesn't mean we don't need things like board management and mission statements and strategic planning. That's all necessary, but it's not sufficient. If you really want to have large-scale impact, you need to think about these principles, and these are the 6 practices that we write about in the book. Working across sectors, becoming a networked nonprofit, and then ultimately cultivating adaptive leadership. So that's sort of the summary of Forces for Good. And the book came out in 2008. Interestingly enough, it came out right before the economic downturn. Right, exactly. And then what happened, right? You remember, we went off a cliff. So we were writing about this and doing this research in a time of, economic exuberance, right? There were a lot of philanthropists making new money in the dot-com bubble and in the tech startups of the 2000s, and many of them are continuing to do that today in Silicon Valley. And we went back and we actually looked at these organizations after the 2008 crash, and we found that not only did they continue to grow, but they continued to have remarkable and outsized impact even during the worst downturn. So we write about that in the updated edition, which is the edition they're selling here. So why does this all matter? Why does this conversation about scale matter to you sitting here in the room? Now, I get that some of you may be running local grassroots organizations, and your goal may not be to scale and have sites in Bakersfield and Fresno and other parts, Inland Empire, other parts of California. Your goal might be, how do I scale my impact in my community? Let's say I'm working in the San Fernando Valley, and in fact, actually in this updated edition of Forces for Good, we have case studies of local nonprofits that use very similar practices to scale their impact in their local community. So again, not necessarily about size and growth, but really about how do I actually have more impact with the community I'm trying to serve. And the reason that this matters is that many, many nonprofits in our sector never actually get really big. I mean, most of the nonprofits in our sector are quite small. In fact, only 0.01% of nonprofits ever get to be above $50 million. Now, in Silicon Valley, $50 million is actually considered fairly small. So as a sector, we actually have, almost 2 million nonprofits in this country. The sector has doubled in size in the last decade. And yet, many of these nonprofits, most of them operate on less than $1 million in budget. I'm just really curious to see in this room, show of hands if your nonprofit is operating on less than $1 million budget. Okay? Okay, what about 1 to 5 million? Raise your hands. Okay, 5 to 10 million? All right, greater than 10 million? Okay, well, that's interesting. It's actually a pretty even distribution in this room. What about greater than 30 million? Okay, we've got a couple big organizations. So pretty broad spread, but again, the point is that many nonprofits by themselves aren't scaling in terms of their own programs or services. And the reason I would argue this matters is that even as the nonprofit sector has doubled in size, even as we've seen all this new philanthropy coming in over the last 2 decades, and really, there's been all this professionalization of the sector over the last 2 decades, for many folks, if you actually look at the problems we're trying to solve, it sometimes seems that they're scaling faster than our solutions. Anybody else feel this way? If you look at climate change, right? If you look at what's happening, with the drought and with weather abnormalities, if you look at homelessness, if you look at K-12 education, we've had 20 years of amazing charter schools and proof points and innovation, and we're starting to see some traction in public schools, but I think everybody in this room would probably agree that our public K-12 education, we're still letting too many kids fall through the cracks, right? We still have a big achievement gap. We still don't have equity. We're still not meeting the needs of the 21st century. And I think historically what we've done in the nonprofit sector is we've taken a technical approach to solving problems. right? We've borrowed a lot of business best practices and said, okay, well, you know, let's use engineering, let's use business thinking, let's use linear logic models to solve problems. That's great if you're trying to build a bridge, like the bridge across the Bay Area, right? We know how to solve technical problems using technical approaches. But if you're trying to solve something like homelessness, it probably looks more like this. And you don't necessarily need to be able to read the fine print on here to get the point of this slide. This is, you know, what they call a spaghetti map. This is actually a systems map. And this systems map is actually of the affordable housing industry in the state of California. So this map was done with folks, including California Wellness Foundation. In fact, they funded this. It was a group called Housing California out of Sacramento that convened a group of nonprofit activists and advocates around housing reform, along with private sector developers, along with government folks and academics. And we got 30 people in a room, and we spent several days mapping the intricacies and complexities of this dynamic system, right? You have to look at market economy, you have to look at the cost of land, you have to look at, you know, jobs and growth. All of this is impacting the housing system, right? Cost of labor, cost of materials. It's a complex and it's a dynamic problem. And so for people working in the affordable housing industry, they were asking the question, like, how can we think differently about solving this problem? And we really need to start by understanding the system that we're working in. So this is what we call a VUCA problem. From the folks who brought us FUBAR, the US military: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I would argue that these kinds of wicked problems, you know, there's a lot of scholars talking about this now, wicked problems, systemic problems, you can't solve these problems with linear and narrow approaches. What we need is we need to begin thinking quite differently about how we solve social problems. And so these are the themes that I'm seeing in my work, and these are the themes that I heard as I went around to different breakout sessions today at the conference. And so Regina had asked me to sort of put a bow around this and sum up. If you think about it, this is kind of the cliff notes for everything you guys have been learning for the last 2 days. So what I'm hoping to do is kind of provide you a framework that really touches on many of the themes of the breakout sessions that you've been to, the amazing lunch and plenary, breakfast plenaries that you heard, all of the speakers you've been hearing from in the last few days. And this is what I'm really focused on in my work. So this list is not entirely comprehensive. There's nothing up here about data and measurement, and right now, as we speak at Stanford Social Innovation Review, there's a 2-day conference on data and big data, leveraging data for social good. So clearly data is a trend that's not on here. But I want to just talk to you very briefly about what I think are 5 of the most important themes in the future of social change, and the things that we need to be paying attention to if we actually want to scale our impact going forward. So first of all, start with the obvious. We didn't actually state this in the book, in Forces for Good, but really, the folks who are most effective at scaling their impact are the ones that really set big, hairy, audacious goals. They're the ones who think about what's my North Star and how am I trying to solve at the scale of the problem. Or as a friend of mine says, it's N equals all. Not just how do I actually get more butts and seats or how do I just serve an incremental number of more people, but how do I actually think systemically about this problem and start to work upstream. So I know you heard this from several other speakers, but how do we start to get to root causes? How do we start to think in terms of long-term solutions? Some of the nonprofits that we wrote about in Forces for Good, Habitat for Humanity, for example, their mission is to actually end what they call poverty housing or substandard housing on the face of the earth. Now granted, they still have a long way to go against that mission, but they have built 500,000 homes and they have mobilized 2.5 million people whose lives have been impacted by volunteering for that organization, who now think and vote differently around the issue of housing. Feeding America. They're a nonprofit organization. Anybody here from a food bank or from one of the soup kitchens, part of Feeding America's network? They have more in common with a Safeway or an Albertsons or a Vons in many ways than with a typical grassroots nonprofit. They've built a vast national network and they move more than 3 billion pounds of food to feed 40 million people via 200 food banks and 50,000 partners. And the Exploratorium, which is one of my favorite examples because they scaled their impact by scaling an idea. They didn't scale their organization. They are one museum in one site in San Francisco. Anybody here been to the Exploratorium? Yeah, and you guys have a Museum of Science and Technology, right, in Los Angeles. So the entire movement of children's museums and interactive science museums was spawned by the Exploratorium. They brought people in to study their model back in the 1970s and 80s. And rather than operating like Starbucks and saying you have to license it or franchise it or we're going to run our own our own franchise sites around the world. They said, take our model, copy it, name it whatever you want, take it back to your community, because we want to scale our impact, and we're going to do that by giving our idea away. So really creative ways of thinking about scale and thinking about impact. Secondly, this point around working across sectors. So I was delighted to see that there was a breakout session here on advocacy and how you actually become more effective at advocacy. When we started doing this research for Forces for Good 7, 8 years ago, many nonprofits in the sector shied away from advocacy. And just over the last 5 years, I've seen a huge growing trend to both funders and nonprofits really embracing advocacy and realizing if you really want to change a system, you've got to have a seat at the table when the rules are being written, right? So City Year is a great example. And I know you have a City Year Los Angeles with the yellow jackets. They were started by 2 Harvard Law School grads back in the late 1980s. And they imagined a world where young people could spend a year serving their communities, right? Many of you are probably familiar with this model. But they also imagined a world beyond just City Year's program. They imagined something that later became AmeriCorps, and they got Bill Clinton really excited about it. So when he was elected president and he passed the AmeriCorps legislation, they were actually able to help create and build a national movement to create AmeriCorps and then sustain that funding so that tens of thousands of young people could serve their communities every year, not just City Year volunteers. So it's a great example of how advocacy and changing policy legislation can help create resources for scale and can sometimes also alter the rules of the game. Secondly, they've also done a great job of engaging the private sector. So Timberland, who's furnished all of their Corps members' uniforms and boots for many, many years, they have more than 100 corporate partners, many of whom give at a level of more than $1 million a year. So they figured out that they need to reach out and engage the private sector because a lot of businesses realize that they can do well and do good at the same time, and that they need to be good corporate citizens. So I briefly sat in on a panel this morning about corporate philanthropy and was delighted to hear some of these themes being talked about. The third important theme to pay attention to, and there were several breakout sessions on this over the last 2 days, is really this theme of building networks, right? And so when we started writing about this, again, 6, 7 years ago, we weren't even sure how to talk about this. We're like, is it collaboration? Is it field building? What is it? We realized that all of these nonprofits and Forces for Good did an amazing job of actually thinking about how to build relationships with other organizations in their sector or field, not just thinking about their own organization, but thinking about how they could have outsized impact by teaming up, right? So now the phrase collective impact has become very current. Anybody here running a collective impact project? So, okay, how many folks are collaborating or in a network? Okay. So collective impact is a pretty narrow definition, right, if you read the FSG articles written in Stanford Social Innovation Review. But collaboration and network building, I think, is a bigger tent, and I think it's one that we all need to be participating in. So networks can be helpful for a number of reasons. They can help us engage folks. If you think about what's happened in philanthropy, SVP had a table out here. I know I'm a member of SV2, which is the Silicon Valley SVP chapter. It's a great way of engaging citizens in doing philanthropy in their community, and saying that you don't need to be Bill Gates or Jeff Skoll to have an impact. You know, you can actually pool your money, put in $5,000, pool it with other people, get involved, take board seats, get really involved in the nonprofit community. This is a great way to engage citizens in scaling impact. Learning, coming together to share information around communities of practice, right? A lot of networks start because they want to share information and create sort of a shared perspective on how we solve these problems. If you think about the Housing California Network, they came together to really create shared understanding of the system they were operating in, and only then did they start to go on to look at innovation and more innovative ways to intervene in the system. And then if you look at this as kind of a continuum, many nonprofit networks go on to get involved in innovation. Networks are great ways of accessing new perspectives, and the ultimate sort of end goal for many of these networks is to create alignment, to say, let's actually start coordinating our activities and working together. So if anyone went to the network breakout session a little bit earlier, they gave several examples. Strive is a great example of a collective impact network, which is creating alignment on cradle to career outcomes, right? They started in Cincinnati. They're now in more than 100 communities are attempting to replicate this model. But the idea is, why don't we create shared goals, align our actions, create shared measurements, and then we'll get better outcomes if we actually coordinate rather than everybody duplicating efforts and reinventing the wheel. And then ultimately, creating systems level change, as REAMP which is a Midwestern network, has done. They've brought together over the last decade more than 150 nonprofits and funders across an 8-state region, and they've managed to shut down 27 coal plants. They've managed to pass energy efficiency legislation in 8 Midwestern states. In short, they've had way more impact by working together than any of these environmental organizations or funders were having when they were just working in isolation and on their own. So I would argue that we live in a world of both and. It's not that organizations are going to go away. We need our nonprofits. They provide a way for us to have some structure, to have some focus, to get paid for doing what we do in many cases. But organizations by themselves, especially in the social sector, they can't get to the level of scale that we need to have real systems level impact. And the only way we get to systems level impact is to begin to combine resources, right? As many did through coalitions and alliances in the last couple of decades, and as we're seeing more and more now, networks coming together to share resources, to create some alignment around the problems that we're trying to solve in our communities. Networks have a lot of benefits, and I'm not going to go into a whole long conversation about this, but organizations tend to be more hierarchical. They tend to be more closed, right? Especially in the private sector, it tends to be a market perspective where they own their IP, they compete with others. In the nonprofit sector, what we're finding is that by teaming up, by sharing resources, by sharing information, we can actually have much greater impact than if we just act on our own. And then fourth, we need to invest in talent and leadership. I was delighted to see so many organizations here that had tables out here that are focused on capacity building. And this is what the Center for Nonprofit Management does so well. But I would argue one of the biggest barriers to scale in the social sector, it's not just money. Everyone says, you know, oh, if we only had more money, we could scale, we could do more. We need to get more creative. Money can be a barrier, but honestly, when I work with social entrepreneurs, half the time I see their biggest barrier to scale is actually talent. And I mean talent at the leadership level of the organization, but also at the board level. So we need to think about how we create new leadership to solve these problems in our communities. And the kinds of leadership that we need and will need 5, 10 years from now is not the kind of organizational hierarchical command and control leadership that many of us have been trained in, right? It's a very different kind of leadership. In fact, John Kenya and Peter Senge wrote an article called System Leadership in Stanford Social Innovation Review that came out about six or 9 months ago. And this is what I'm seeing in my work, that the leaders who are really effective at working in these new ways are the ones who are open and more open to emergence, not always having the answer be pre-known, not having that 3-year strategic plan that's set in stone and you feel like you have to just kind of continue marching down that path. Right? They're systems thinkers. They actually think about the whole system and they think systemically about solving these problems. They're risk takers and innovators, and of course they build relationships and collaborate. We're seeing a lot of these traits, by the way, in the millennial generation. Right? The digital natives, they've grown up with a lot of this technology. They've grown up thinking differently about leadership. They're boundary crossers. So they're the leaders who are willing to reach across sector aisles and realize that to solve some of these complex problems, we've all got to start working together. And they bring everything they've got, both the hard analytical, kind of what I would call the MBA skill set, but also the softer skill set, the high EQ, the emotional intelligence. I wrote a report last year for the Levi Strauss Foundation, and it's available on my LinkedIn page. It's free, or you can go to Levi Strauss Foundation and download it, but it's called Pioneers in Justice. It's actually looking at a number of leaders in the Bay Area who had inherited legacy organizations. So I loved the poll earlier about the age of organizations in the audience. So these organizations were all more than 40 years old, and guess what? Many of them were calcified and had become too bureaucratic, and they weren't able to compete, and they weren't able to sustain their impact in the fast-paced, high-tech, networked world that we live in the Bay Area. So these new Gen X leaders, all of them people of color, all of them inheriting organizations like the ACLU Northern California, the Lesbian Center for Human Rights, Chinese for Affirmative Action. They took over these organizations, and Levi Strauss paid to put them through a 5-year cohort leadership program where they really worked on developing these new kinds of leadership skills. They brought in experts on social media. They figured out how to upgrade all of their systems. They figured out how to get their lawyers on Twitter and not be completely freaked out by it. They worked with their boards, and what we saw was this interesting way in which they really started to think about, investing in the leader and the leadership mindsets kind of at the center of this, taking these young leaders and giving them the support they needed, helping them reconfigure and rethink their organization. So flatten those hierarchies, build more engaged boards, think about how they engage with their constituents, build networks in their fields. ACLU Northern California, amazing case study. Again, it's written up in the book. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but they started a Spanish website, and they've been doing a ton of outreach to Spanish-speaking communities in California because they're like, ACLU California, our membership age, average age is like 67, white and male. Like, that's not really about where the future of California and social justice issues are, so we need to engage a more diverse constituency. And then building social movements. So they were all at the forefront of working on immigration reform in the state of California. And then lastly, adapting and innovating. So again, I think this is where we can learn a lot from programs like the Stanford Design School, from folks who have been talking about design thinking and how we might apply design thinking to social change, right? Again, I was trained, in business school and as a strategy consultant, I was really trained to think about strategy in terms of start with the end in mind, figure out the right approach, do all this, data and analytics, and then work backwards and figure out what the organization should be doing. Design thinking folks come at it a totally different way. It's like approaching it from a bottom-up perspective rather than a top-down perspective. They start by empathizing. Let's go observe customers. Let's go out in the field. Let's be really user-centered. Let's see what the people who we're serving can teach us about our products and our services, right? So they really go out into the field, more of an anthropological approach. And then they learn from that. They ideate. They say, what are we learning? What are some good ideas, some new innovations that we can come up with around our programs or services? They go out and they prototype. So rather than thinking and planning and thinking 5 years out, they say, let's just try a bunch of stuff and see what sticks, right? So they learn by doing rather than learning by planning. And there's recently been some interesting work being done around the convergence of strategy and design thinking. So there are a lot of folks in this field who are realizing strategy needs to incorporate more of design thinking, and design thinking maybe, just maybe, needs to incorporate some of the lessons from strategy, and realize that not every single complex problem can be solved with pipe cleaners and sticky notes, even though they're a lot of fun. So, interesting debate, right, about design thinking and strategy, but I think the bottom line is we need to build organizations that are adaptive, and we need to be okay with trying things out and occasionally failing. And I know that's really hard in the social sector. We're all terrified about what our funders are going to think, but even funders today are talking about the need to prototype and learn in real time, not just wait 5 years later to do an evaluation to see if that thing you did 5 years ago actually worked. So this was just a convening that a group of us ran for funders in the early childhood development space, where we used the design thinking and strategy approach, kind of a mashup, to really look at some innovative new solutions in early childhood development. And this was supported by the Packard Foundation and some other funders interested in this space. So all of this comes together in some of the work I'm doing in Fresno. So I want to share this really quick case study, and then I'm going to have you guys do a brief writing exercise and share at your tables. So, I think our images of leadership are really changing, and especially in a state like California. Leadership doesn't look like Moses with the tablets coming down off the mountain anymore, right? Or even the heroic individual social entrepreneur. I mean, I grew up in the era of like Wendy Kopp, who I respect and admire so tremendously. But more and more leadership looks like this. It's diverse, it's collective, it's cross-generational, right? It's cross-cultural, and it's cross-sector. So the work I'm doing in Fresno really is about trying to figure out if we can take leaders who are in a place, working in business, working in government, working in nonprofit, working in the faith sector, health, media, bring them together and actually get them to start collaborating across sectors around some of these complex problems. So this is, again, kind of breaking out of the silos of thinking in terms of nonprofit, for-profit, and government, and saying, you know what, we need all the sectors at the table if we're going to solve these problems. So this is an experiment that we've been running for 2.5 years, funded by the James Irvine Foundation, and I'm aware that there are other programs like that down here. I know that the Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles has a great cross-sector leadership program. The new toolkit for social change, we're not just focused on Myers-Briggs types and sort of classic individual leadership development. What we're really trying to do is create collective leadership in the community. So we're teaching them systems thinking. We're doing some work around systems thinking and systems mapping, network building, and social network analysis. So this is what I call the new toolkit for social change. Cross-sector collaboration, There's a lot of work being done in this cross-sector space, a couple articles published in Harvard Business Review over the last year or two at the Presidio Institute up in San Francisco. Their whole mission is focused on creating cross-sector leadership. Design thinking, so again, bringing in some of this notion around innovation, design thinking, what can we learn about solving complex problems in a city or in a community. Group dynamics, and leadership and mindfulness. So this is just a smattering, but this is what I think leaders need to start paying attention to and learning, and I was really happy to see a number of these topics on the agenda at this conference. And what we've seen is pretty phenomenal. In just 2.5 years, we've run 4 cohorts, 6 months per cohort. Each cohort has 12 people. We've seen them grow as individuals. We've seen phenomenal network growth. We've seen real innovation in the community and real collaborations coming out of this. So I'm going to just very quickly show you some network maps. And for any of you who went to Ann Watley's session on networks, she did a whole kind of more in-depth review of how to read network maps. But these blue and red dots represent individuals in the cohort. So this was the very, very first cohort, and you could see, you know, a lot of the nonprofit people were connected to other nonprofit people, but they weren't very connected to some of the Fresno State people or people from other sectors. This was the second-degree networks of the people in our cohort. So we also mapped who do they know in the community because we wanted to know who are they influencing and who are they influenced by. This was after 1 year, so after 2 cohorts. You can see immediately all these lines represent relationships that have now been formed, information that's flowing, social connections, collaborations, work that's happening in the community. And this is the entire full network map, including second-degree connections after 1 year. So basically what this does, social network analysis, it's a way of visualizing something that's typically quite squishy, social capital or civic infrastructure, right? This is a way of beginning to visualize the relationships in the community that are the underpinning for actually getting things done. And we've also seen more than 70 at this stage collaborations come out of this network. We haven't required them to do projects, but what they have done is by mapping their system, by identifying assets in the community and really deeply understanding what one another are doing, they've started to actually combine their assets in new ways. So for example, the Fresno County Librarian has 32 libraries in her network, and she reached out to other people in this leadership network and said, hey, I've got a distribution platform. Let's think really creatively about what we can do beyond books and literacy and computers and internet access. So they're running summer feeding programs for kids in the community through libraries. They've started a citizenship academy where they're doing education for immigrants and helping them pass their citizenship test. They've actually had more than 12 collaborations just focused on the library, working with other partners in this network. And then lastly, we're seeing kind of community-wide change start to happen. This will take a decade. This is not the kind of change that happens overnight. But again, cross-sector collaborations, there's one group that's working on creating community capacity building and bringing some of this social change toolkit to neighborhood and community residents. There's another group that's doing collective impact, so there's a Strive site and there's a children's movement led by First Five. And there's more than 300 nonprofits, businesses, and government agencies in Fresno that are really starting to work on this cradle to career continuum around education outcomes. And then lastly, there's a whole group working on downtown revitalization, which, trust me, Fresno really needs. The downtown is like pretty abandoned and pretty sad. You know, it's been a victim of too much sprawl and too much white flight, but there's a whole group that's really reinvesting in the downtown. So what I'd like you to do now is take out you've got your pen and paper, so I want you to think back. I'm going to just put the list up here one more time. I want you to think back on the 5 principles I listed here, focusing on impact, working across sectors, building networks, investing in human capital, and innovation. And I want you to just very quickly rank your organization against these 5. Just sort of give yourself, you know, an A, B, C, D. How well are you doing against these 5? And then just take 30 seconds to do that. And then I want you to have a quick conversation at your table about which of these areas you think you could, you think would be useful to focus on for your organization.
You know, one of the things that we need to really think about at the center is this cross-sector piece. You know, that we really are focusing on helping nonprofits. And what ends up happening is you're all impacted by government and business and economics and so many people that we don't tend to invite, even the funders. So we're going to have to think about that if we really want to make an impact.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
So, it's interesting. It's been a great couple of days, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Sure. And I think there's been several themes that it seems like have come out of the conference. And, a lot of it is really how can we innovate? How can we kind of take the next step and start to do things differently? So many of us have been around for a while, and yet there's this new generation coming in that has great ideas. How do we support that? And then I think the part of it that we all feel kind of icky a little bit about talking about, but has really come forward at this conference, and I hope has helped people to feel empowered, is really talking about that compensation aspect of it. How can we begin to take the risk as individuals, as board members, as executive directors, to have those conversations and to really express to our communities, to our boards, to our constituents, how important it is to support our staffs so that we can do the work that we want to do, so that we can attract the best and the brightest, so that we can keep people in the career, so that people really want to view this as a really attractive career. And I think so many of us do it from passion, and we were just talking about this at the table, but it's not enough. Everyone wants to be passionate, but we all have to live in our homes, and we have to raise our kids, and we have to put them in college, and these are the things that we deal with. And I think we, as a sector, have a hard time feeling entitled to say, you know what, I work really hard, and I'm entitled to be generously compensated. And I think that's something that has come out of the conference, I know for me, has helped me to feel more empowered to have those conversations, not just for myself and my organization, but just across the sector. And I think it's really important that we feel supported. So I appreciate that.
That's great. And, I didn't talk about it here in the presentation, but there's a whole other chapter in Forces for Good at the end. And we do two things. We look at talent and paying for talent. And we look at the actual data for salaries for a lot of the organizations in Forces for Good. And guess what? Many of them are paying, okay, so maybe not the same level as like corporate compensation, but pretty close. Like some of them are paying $150, $200, $250. This is 8 years ago. Heritage Foundation CEO, this is all public information. It's available on GuideStar from the 1990s. Thank you, GuideStar. CEO of the Heritage Foundation, I think was making $600,000, and that was 8 years ago, right? They're all about market-based economics. They're a nonprofit, but you may not agree with their ideology, but they pay their CEO very well. And I do think that we have completely undervalued talent as a sector. I mean, one of the reasons I went back to business school is as a social entrepreneur, I was making $18,000 a year and had no health care. And when I was 28 years old and broke my arm and had to ask for my parents to bail me out, I'm like, okay, I got to find a way to have a sustainable business model for myself, right? And so, I understand you've all had a very rich conversation about overhead and the myth of overhead, and Dan Pallotta said it, in his TED Talks better than any of us could, but I do think we need to invest in our people and invest in our talent and recognize that, this is what great companies spend money on. They outspend the nonprofit sector. For-profit businesses outspend the nonprofit sector significantly when it comes to leadership and talent development. So I think we do need to invest in our people. That's an awesome comment. Okay. Yes, we'll take one more comment or question.
I was fascinated by your thing about the whole thing in Fresno, and I hate to use the F word, but how is that whole thing financed?
Oh, finance? Yeah. I was like, which F word? Fresno? No. It is all funded by the James Irvine Foundation. So they wanted to, they have an office here in LA. Many of you probably know them. They give $70 million a year, right, primarily around youth, arts, and democracy, the 3 program areas. They have a special initiative area focused on underinvested regions, so San Joaquin Valley and the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, Riverside. And in those regions, they really wanted to invest in capacity building because not only do those regions get far less philanthropic investment than Los Angeles and the Bay Area, but because of many of the challenges and problems, like the leaders there are really, really struggle, and there's really high rates of burnout, and there's brain drain problems, right? People leave and they go where they can make more money and have an easier life. And so Irvine has been very committed to investing in capacity building, and that's why they decided to fund this program. So right now, participants don't have to pay anything. There are other models out there, the Chamber of Commerce models, the American Leadership Forum Silicon Valley, which requires participants pay something as well. So there are different business models for funding leadership development. In this case, it happens to be all funded by Irvine. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
You talk in your scaling your impact, about innovation, but how do we as leadership teams build nimbleness into our organization? Because part of getting there is being nimble enough to recognize it and capitalize on it.
Yeah, so one of the trickiest things about leadership is just cultivating this judgment, right? Judgment about when to go slow, when to go fast, when to stick to a plan, when to pivot, right? And over time you develop some pattern recognition around that. But I think, one of the things I've seen work is a lot of these organizations, getting lots of feedback, getting real-time data, and there are more and more technologies and platforms and tools for that, so that we're not just thinking of evaluation as the sort of summative after the fact, like did it work or didn't it work, kind of binary, but we're really thinking about how do we use data and feedback from our customers, from our teams, from what we're observing. Some of this is just as simple as reflecting on, is this thing we're doing working, and having those honest conversations as a team. So in many ways, it's about cultivating that learning culture, that continuous improvement culture, and then using data, whatever kind of data. Again, it doesn't all have to be random controlled trial, $1 million funded. That's the gold standard, but I think there's lots of other ways we can get feedback and we can get input and we can evaluate, self-evaluate as we go. Like we're using network mapping to evaluate this network, and we use SurveyMonkey to survey every participant after every convening. So we're just baking it in. We're like, we want to know if what we're doing is working, so let's just bake it in. And guess what? It doesn't even cost very much. Like there's free open source tools out there, SurveyMonkey, network mapping, there's free open source network mapping platforms, Gephi and Node Excel for all the techies in the room. Come find me later and I'll give you tips. So yeah, I think we need to do a better job of learning, and then that leads to adaptation, because then we know, where we need to fix things, right? So, and having honest conversations, not being afraid to talk about what's working and not working, and somehow that's been really, really scary for a long time, right? All right, you guys have been great. I want you to go get ice cream, and I'll stay and answer more questions at the book signing. So.
Thank you.